Can you try and say something, V?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah!
Oh, great.
There you go.
Yay. Amazing.
Okay, so I think the problem's fixed now.
Okay, fingers
I
crossed.
hope can definitely hear you now from
Great.
where I'm sitting. Okay, thanks everyone for your patience. Thanks, V, especially for your patience. I'm glad we can finally begin. And I wanted to start with a show of hands. How many of you have read a book by V before?
Mhm.
That is almost everyone. I'm in good company. Um, for those of you who have never read anything by Victoria, I'll briefly introduce her. V.E. Schwab is the New York Times bestseller author of 20 plus books, among which are the Shades of Magic series, the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, I'm sorry, which of course became a TikTok sensation. And now Gallant has finally come out. And I wanted to start off by asking you, do you want to tell us something about Gallant?
Sure. I'm so glad we got it working because I really wanted to get to chat with you all. I like to describe Gallon as the Secret Garden meets Crimson Peak. It's the story of a teenage girl named Olivia Pryor who has spent almost all of her life in an orphanage with nothing of her family except for a journal that she was found with. The journal contains these entries from her mother that seem to devolve into madness and illustrations that make no sense. But at the back of the journal is a letter to Olivia that warns her she will be safe as long as she stays away from Gallant. And for years, Olivia has no idea what that means until one day she receives a letter from an uncle she's never met inviting her home to the family estate, which is called Gallant. And when she gets there, she discovers no uncle, a house falling into disrepair, and a garden wall with a locked door that seems to lead nowhere.
Well, if that doesn't sound intriguing, I don't know what does. Again, can I see a show of hands? Who of you has read Gallant already?
Oh,
Nice. So that's quite a lot of people. I have read it as well. I absolutely loved it. Um, and I wanted to ask, in an interview with Taylor Jenkins Reid, you asked her what ingredients come first. If you see a book as a recipe, what ingredients come first? So I wanted to ask you kind of the same question. How did this work with Gallant? Which ingredients came first? Which came last? What was the process like?
the house came first. The estate of Gallant. Usually, setting is not only a main character in my novels, it's one of the very first characters that I come up with. And so I had this location, I had this place, but what I really had was that locked door in the garden wall. And for it, one of the reasons this book took about 5 years to do, and that was because for 4 years I thought I was writing a fairy tale. I had all the trappings of a fairy tale. Like you have the garden wall with the door, and that means there's some place beyond the door, and that makes you think of home and away, here and there, domestic and wild. I thought I was telling a fairy tale, and I kept trying and failing. I kept looking at this locked door, wondering what was on the other side. And, I'm a huge fan of authors like Holly Black who do the fairy tale so well. But I'm not Holly, right? I don't want to repeat, and I can't do what she's done. So I found myself staring at this door for years until one day I realized that I wasn't writing a fairy tale, I was writing a death tale. I was writing an underworld tale. And as soon as I realized that that was the difference, not home and away, but living and dead, that was what was waiting beyond the door, all of the rest of the pieces clicked into place. But that locked door in the garden wall was kind of the first ingredient.
Nice, thank you. And you've been an established author for a while now. I mean, the success of the Shades of Magic series was already huge. But I feel like with the success of Eddie, that was at a new level, I feel like. And I was wondering how has that experience been, and has that influenced your writing for Galland?
Ooh, the honest answer is very complicated. Yes, so my books I feel like were very successful within their own genre. And then Addie LaRue, thanks in huge part to TikTok, found an audience of a completely new degree. Not only like a louder audience within my own area, but also audiences I never would have touched before, who never would have read my books. Because I think on the surface, people assume I write fantasy, and people think of fantasy as one kind of thing. But you take a novel like Addie LaRue, which is technically fantastical, it's fantasy, but it's the kind of literary fantasy that people who don't think they like fantasy pick up. So I feel like my books end up as kind of gateways into fantasy because my fantasy is super grounded in reality most of the time. And so
Yeah.
Addie became a much larger book, of course, much faster than I ever anticipated. And it was an extraordinary thing. I mean, I gained millions of readers in the course of a year that I didn't have before. But it made writing the next book utterly terrifying. Like, it's
I can
always really hard
imagine.
when a book does well. It's hard when a book doesn't do well, but you know how to push through that. You just write another book. And none of my books are the same. They all kind of work to a different audience, so I never feel kind of hindered in that way. But when a book does so well, you start to lose faith in whatever comes next. You start to lose faith because you worried that people only want the thing that you've just written. And for better or worse, I never do the same thing twice. So I knew that no matter what I wrote next, it wouldn't be like Addie. But I was really deeply afraid to write anything after Addie. And so, for better or worse, though, I was in the opening months of the pandemic, in the months leading up to Addie LaRue, when I wrote Gallant. And it almost helped that it's such a different story and such a different shape and such a different size and such a different angle that I could really embrace that, apples to oranges. But I'm not gonna
Mhm.
lie, like, creatively, it's really frightening to change course when the course you're on is working really well.
Thank you. Well, I think the course you're on is definitely also writing completely different things every time you do something new. I mean, there's no way to compare um, Galland and Addie,
I'm
which makes it
grateful
so
for
awesome.
that.
Actually, yeah, and I think Galland actually celebrated its second week on the New York Times bestseller list, if I
5.
remember. There we go. I'm sorry for underestimating
No, no,
you.
no, no, no. It was number one for 3 weeks. It's been chilling in the upper five, I would say, for
Oh,
5.
that's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's always a bit like you just kind of think, oh no, like you start to set a new baseline, right? And you have to like look at a book like Addie as such an outlier that you don't want to reset it as a baseline. But I think somewhere inside your creative heart, you like hope that the books that come after will do well. So I'm really, really grateful that a strange, quiet, death obsessed book like Gallant is doing well.
Definitely. So one of the things I think it's very interesting that you said about the Shades of Magic series, I think in particular, but also Vicious and Vengeful, is that every character you write has a piece of you in it, like a certain characteristic trait, especially with Raquel and Lila. And I was wondering, like, did you do the same thing with Gallant, and
Yes.
particularly with Olivia?
I mean, it's so interesting. So there's 3 characters in the book that really have like large pieces of myself in them: Olivia, her cousin Matthew, and the master of the house. The master of the house is the villain, antagonistic force in the book, and also kind of like the god figure. And anytime I have a character that gets to be a little bit more dietic, a little bit more god figure, I feel like that's a little bit of the author stepping in, because the author is a little bit like the god of their world when they're writing. But Olivia and Matthew, whenever I'm writing a novel with a teenage protagonist, I'm writing for a very specific version of myself. So, you look at my adult books and it's like Vicious, I wrote when I was 25 and it was written to 25-year-old me. Addie was written when I was 32 and it was written to 32-year-old me. But with the books with teen protagonists, I'm looking back at a really specific version of me. And I look at who I was when I was Olivia's age. And I was like, for instance, I was in the closet, but I like didn't know that I was in the closet. Like I was so deeply closeted that all I knew was that I didn't feel at home in my body and in my life and in my environment and my identity. And a lot of that felt like I couldn't find the vocabulary to articulate what I was going through. And it was so incredibly lonely. And so Olivia Pryor is a nonverbal protagonist. And so looking at the way that like not having a common language, a common method of communication creates so much isolation in her world was something. Matthew, I feel like Matthew is every author after like 10 books. He's so tired. He like really just wants to like rest for a little while. And I definitely think pandemic me, I was so burned out after Addie. And then it wasn't burned out from Addie. I was burned out and I kept going for like 3 more books. And then Addie was a book that took 10 years to come to fruition. And it left a kind of like a grave in its wake, an open grave. It gutted me. And so I was tired in a really spiritual way, in a really deep way. And I feel like I channeled all of that wariness into Matthew. So yeah, each of those 3 characters, especially given the time I was writing them, it was like March and through July of 2020. Like it was a very specific kind of fear and loneliness and claustrophobia.
I think it's interesting what you said about Olivia's being nonverbal, because I wanted to ask about that as well. So actually, thanks for answering that as well. I think it's such a strong way of portraying that sense of being lost.
Well, and I just wanted to say, like, because I think that's one facet of the nonverbal element for her, but like, I just want to be like explicit too, like, there's a lot of it also was as a challenge I set for myself as an author. We have so many defaults when it comes to creative work, and dialogue is a huge crutch that we use, right? And so I wanted to explore like the different shapes that a voice takes, and the different ways that we make ourselves understood or not understood. And like Olivia's nonverbalness is so integral to the story that like there was never an iteration of the story where she was verbal, to the extent that like one of the first things I figure out as a writer is the point of view and tense I'm going to tell the story in. And I chose to tell the story in third person, not in Olivia's point of view, because I knew that it would have an audiobook. And if I wrote the book in first person and then it had an audiobook, you would end up with a narrator supplanting Olivia's voice and giving it an actual verbal context, right? So like it was a thing that this book is so hers. And so her nonverbal element is like, I would say that it's an exploration of the idea that like not spoken doesn't mean silent. I feel like Olivia's voice comes through incredibly clearly in the book without a single line of dialogue from her.
Yeah. I never would have thought that is something you have to take into consideration, the creation of an audio, because a lot of people nodding here. So I think this was an aha moment for a lot of us. And something that you said just now made me wonder about the journal, because you kind of wrote a novel within a novel. Why did you decide to do that?
Ooh, because I'm very ornery and I really wanted to have a found object. And also, in a lot of ways, Gallant is my first ever all ages read. Like I have middle grade novels, I have YA novels, I have adult novels. And because success has afforded me a creative luxury. Like Gallant is not a book I would have been able to publish with the support that it had at the beginning of my career. The fact is, like, Gallant is a risk. Galland is a book with a teenage protagonist that could be middle grade YA or adult, depending on how it's read and styled. I like every time I hit a creative break where I saw where I could make the story choice I wanted to make, or make the choice that would make it fit more cleanly into a category. I had the luxury of choosing for the story. And one of the elements is the illustrations and the journal, which really defy the age and genre that it's in, and are integral to the story. And also, I had worked in comics for a few years, which is a really creative collaboration, but bringing imagery into a book was an extraordinary creative trust fall, because like I'm handing a piece of the story over to a different creator. They're not just augmenting, it's not just decorative, right? The illustrations in the journal are a part of the story. And so I almost had to write the descriptions for that section as if somebody who couldn't see would need to know what was happening. So I essentially wrote an audiovisual description for the imagery that then went to the artist. I'm a poet by trade. Like that's how I started. And I really love finding excuses to put poetry, like to put my poetry in my books. And every now and then I figure out how, like in our Dark Duet, which is the second Monsters of Verity book, there's a monster point of view, and the monster point of view is told in free verse. And then in this, the journal entries from the mother, Olivia takes them to be madness. But if you think about poetry, when it's not understood properly, can kind of read like madness. It can read as almost nonsensical. It can read like you're not there inside the creator's head in the right way. So I essentially took the journal entries from Olivia's mother and I wrote each one as a little poem. So there were all these little components that I wanted to play with and bring in. And I just had like this incredible luxury coming off of Addie, where I thought, if there's any time for me to tell a story I want to tell and have the publisher have faith in me that they can sell it, it's going to be right after Addie.
Yeah, definitely. No, this is why I thought the timing of um the the journal in the book was so good, because of the timing, everything suddenly starts to make sense, because you do see Olivia reading pieces of it, kind of misunderstanding it, guessing what it means, and then you get the journal and then you finally understand what's going on, or at least a bigger part of
Well,
it.
you're kind of racing, right? You're kind of like, I love stories
Yeah.
that sit you against the main character to understand what's happening. So it's almost a race to see if you can come to the conclusions before Olivia does.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to look at my colleague. Do we have time for one more question? One more question, and then we're going to go to some audience questions. As a last question, I wanted to ask you, you've worked in so many different age groups. You've definitely defied genres, and you've worked with different media, with comics. I think you're also writing episodes. So I wanted to ask, is there anything genre-wise or medium-wise that you would like to try that you have not yet tried?
Ooh, I think the only thing I don't have interest in is realism. Because like for me, that's not why I write. For me, I want the world to be stranger than it is. I want to be able to like find the cracks where the magic gets through. So writing something that doesn't have at least like the promise of the supernatural doesn't hold interest. And I know I answered that question in reverse by saying what I don't want to do, because pretty much everything else
Okay.
excites me. Like I really want to do a sci-fi, but I have one I have one that I'm working on pulling together
Oh,
that's
that's
very
very
inspired by like
exciting.
a lot of my favorite anime energy, like very like Psychopaths meets Alias. So like I'm trying to play in like the sci-fi spaces that excite me. But really, just like every book, I try not to think about it from the perspective of where it sits. Like I have a project that's like in super early stages that's going to be a vampire novel, but I want it to be able to sit in the same section that Addie did. So I want it to have that kind of, it's like essentially a novel about anger. It's a novel about like what it feels like to be collateral damage in someone else's story. So like I think there's like you can say where you think the genre would go or where a book would sit on a shelf, but it really is just in the execution, right? Like it's just how the story's told. So basically, I'm entering I'm entering the stage of my career where I just want to write the stories I want to write and like think less about where on the shelf they go. And that is really exciting to me, but it does mean that I think a little bit less about whether something is thriller or horror or sci-fi or, and as long as it's not realism, then I'm happy.
Well, I think it's really working for you because I heard some very excited noises here in the audience. So I think that's definitely gonna go well. I think then it's time for some audience questions. So I'd like to invite
Don't
Minen
be
and Diana to
shy.
ask the question. There we go. Hi.
Hi. Okay, this is very scary because you're my favorite author ever.
Oh.
And I've read so many of your books. I'm just wondering, what is a book of yours that you think does not get enough attention?
Oh, that's such a good question. Honestly, The Savage Song, which is my Monsters of Verity series, the first book in it, it's essentially a world where violence begins to breed actual monsters. But it's about two teenagers in this world. It's about a girl named Kate Harker who thinks that she needs to become monstrous in order to survive in this new world. And it's about a boy named August Flynn who happens to be a monster and would give anything to be human. And like, I'm so proud of that book. And I feel like I've been really fortunate that Addie's been like a tide that has lifted a lot of my books. Like I've watched people come in with Addie and then find Shades and find Vicious, and I feel like I just want to be like, go to Savage Song. Like go there. Like, and I know that like TikTok loves a sad story. And the end of book 2 is like really sad. So I feel like every time TikTok's like crying and they're like really happy about crying, I want to be like, okay, but like I know it's 2 books, not 1, but the end of our dark duet is like definitely tears worthy. So I wish that those books got a little bit more love.
So everyone, we need to get these books and we need to cry about them.
Please.
And the other question I had, you kind of already answered it a little bit, but what's next?
Ooh.
Like, what book can we expect from you after Galland?
Well, I'm in the final chapters of the first Threads of Power book, which is the 4th Shades of Magic book. This is where it's very confusing to me. So it's like Shades of Magic is 3 books, and then Threads of Power is the next 3 books. It's set 7 years after the end of Conjuring of Light, which is the end of Shades of Magic. So it's like Shades of Magic and then Threads of Power. But like anyone who survived a Conjuring of Light is like a main character in the new arc. So I never know whether to call it book 4 or book 1. I have a feeling this is going to be a problem when it comes closer to publication because nobody knows how to refer to it. But I'm like a week away from finishing. So I'm really stressed out and very excited about that. And then I have the 3rd book in the Vicious series, Victorious. And I have a TV show happening very soon. I can't say when. It's like Netflix will kill me, but like very soon, like in the very near future. And it's called First Kill. And it's essentially like a teenage gay Buffy. It's a story about.
Do we need anything else?
No, so it's a story about
a
teenage girl vampire named Juliet who needs to commit her first kill in order to like fully become a vampire. And she has a crush on a new girl at her school named Calliope. And the two end up together at a party, and she goes to bite Calliope, and Calliope goes to stake her in the heart. And it turns out that her new crush is a vampire hunter. And it is just like, it's just the show I wish I'd had when I was a teenager. And it airs on Netflix this summer.
I think everyone's beyond excited.
Yeah.
Who has a question?
Anyone?
Sorry if I sounded a little weird. I caught a cold a few days ago.
No worries.
Now, what is your favorite age range to write for?
Ooh, that's a really good question. There are things I love about writing for all of them because like the middle grade is where I get to be scariest. Because that's the thing. I think kids are just like way braver than us. But I will say There's a relief that comes with writing my adult books because, like I said earlier, I'm writing to who I am right now. I'm not having to like go back and access a previous version of myself. And I was like I was such an unhappy teenage. I was like a super morbid kid and then like a really stressed out, unhappy teenager. And at least like as an adult, I get to work on the books at the age that I am right now. And that is really freeing for me. It's also really scary when you're doing something like continuing a series, right? Because there's like several years between the last Shades of Magic book I wrote and this one, and I've continued to grow as a writer. And so the books are going to be a little different because I'm not the same person, but at the same time I try to make it feel like I grew up and the characters grew up together.
Next question.
Hi. So I really like the way you write your characters, and I was wondering, are there any characters that are really special to you, like personally special, and who are they?
There are a few. I mean, I don't want to play favorite. Like, I love all of my characters. People are always like, are there any characters you hate? And I'm like, I wouldn't write them that way. Like, there are characters who do difficult things, but I always have to feel empathy for my characters, regardless of who they are in the books. That said, Henry Strauss in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is the closest thing to an autobiographical character I have ever written. So he's basically me if I had not found writing. And at the time that I did. So for me, he's so dear to me that he's the only character I've ever written that I like feel personally wounded when people don't like him. I feel like they're saying they don't like me. Holland in the Shades of Magic series is one of the dearest characters to my heart, and Victor Vale is also one of the most autobiographical characters, minus the like murder and super villainy. But like seriously, like, he was me at that age. Like at 25, he was autobiographical for me. And then Lila Bard.
I think we have another question coming.
Hi. Well, Galland was my first book I've read of you, and it was like my first fantasy book. If I could, it's a fantasy. Yeah, it's a fantasy. It was my first fantasy book, and I really enjoyed it. And I also loved your writing style and the way you described the house. And I was really wondering, what book of yours or books do you recommend for me as a beginner to fantasy? Because this book didn't feel like a heavy book to me, even though it was pretty heavy, but it was so easy to read, and I really want to like expand my genres.
Ooh, okay. First of all, welcome. I'm like, now I'm starting to realize that people are going to like, there are going to be people for whom Gallant is my first book. And that's super exciting because up until now, there were just a lot of people for whom Addie was first. And like each book I write, I realize that for some people, it's going to be their first. That's kind of just like a mind trip thing for an author. But it really depends. This is where like your fellow readers will probably be more helpful than me, because it really depends where you're at and what you're in the mood for. The bifurcation I would send you to is either Vicious or A Darker Shade of Magic. A Darker Shade of Magic's a little heavier in the fantasy, but I still feel like it's super accessible. Vicious is more like if you're in a Marvel mood, like if you want Professor X and Magneto having like a toxic bromance in med school, that's Vicious. And if you want like super queer coded characters moving through alternate Londons, that's Shades of Magic. So like very different vibes. It's like choosing between like, I don't know, like sushi and Italian, both amazing foods, but like it depends where you want to go. Exactly. Here's what I'll say.
Yeah.
This is what will make me happy. If you try one of my other series and it's not for you, try something else. Because like that's the thing. When I say that I don't write any of my books for exactly the same audience, the upside of that, like the downside is, of course, you can't just like blitz through and assume you'll like everything equally. But the upside is that like you'll probably like figure out exactly where your lane is within my work. That's a very unsatisfying answer, but I would probably if I would like
it's good.
you're in. Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
of course.
Okay, the last question. Who has a question?
Be brave.
I have a more specific question about a book, about
Yeah.
Eddie. The end. I was really surprised with the ending, actually, and I was wondering, when did you make it up? Like, was it did you mean for that ending since the beginning, or did you make it up later in writing?
Okay, I know. And this is to keep it spoiler free. The ending of Addie is extremely contentious. But here's what
Yeah.
I will say is that I stand by it because I write my endings first. 21 novels, 21 times the endings have been written before the rest of the book, and then I'm kind of like moving toward it. Here's what I will say. One of the reasons that Addie took so long to write was I needed to find an ending that I felt did respect to Addie instead of making it so that both of the male characters in the book won and she lost. And it was really difficult to find that. And I stand by the ending of Addie because I think that it's the only iteration where she gains something too. And it's really hard, right? Like, it's not a happy ending. I think it is a hopeful one. But I also, whenever I write standalones, I'm kind of ornery about endings because I feel like there are fantasy authors who write a house and give you the keys to the house and let you go into the house and explore the entire house. I am the kind of fantasy author that writes you a house, doesn't give you the key, but like parts the curtains for a little while and then closes the curtains again at the end. And like, you have to assume everyone is still living inside the house, but you have to go on. Like, you don't get to be there anymore. But like, I want you to feel like all the people are continuing to live, that they don't stop existing as soon as you close the book, you know? But yeah, I had the ending, as with every single one of my books, I had the ending first.
Okay, thank you. It felt very intentional as well,
Yeah,
I must say. And very, thank you for your explanation.
Of course.
Okay.
So I think that's it. Firstly, I want to thank you, V, for your time. And thank you so much for your thoughtful answers. I think everyone really enjoyed listening to you. Everyone wave. Wave goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope you all enjoy the
There's
book.
about 150 people like
Oh
right
my
in front of
God.
you. You can see our entire theater is filled to the brim.
No,
There's people standing as well. I don't know exactly how much you can see. I think you can only see the people behind me.
well, I
But
just wanted to say, until I can be there in person later this year, I just want to say it is so nice to get to talk with you guys.
thank you so much.
Bye.